A steel skeleton, the length of 2.5 football fields, drifts over a midnight ocean. Inside, sailors sip coffee, check gauges, and listen to the anxious hiss of wind as the barometer falls. Somewhere off the New Jersey coast in April 1933, the sky itself decides to take this ship. It was the pride of a bold new idea, a flying aircraft carrier that promised to change American history. In less than an hour, it would become the deadliest airship disaster the world has ever known. This is the story of the USS Akron. Imagine a Navy carrier that never touches the sea. In the early 1930s, that was not science fiction, it was strategy. The US Navy rigid airship USS Akron embodied a daring concept. If you could lift a hangar into the sky, you could scout far beyond the horizon for the battle fleet. You could carry small fighters to fan out across hundreds of miles, relay reconnaissance, and guide the Navy toward advantage long before a shot was fired. Goodyear Zeppelin Corporation in Akron, Ohio, in the vast Goodyear Air Dock, was a cathedral of aluminum. Inside, helium-filled vast gas cells, buoying a craft that stretched roughly 785 feet bow to stern and enclosed about 6.5 million cubic feet of lifting gas. 8 engines gave it speed, more than 80 miles an hour, in ideal conditions. And an internal hangar, complete with a T-shaped trapeze, allowed it to launch and recover small biplanes in flight. Those aircraft were Curtiss F-9C Sparrowhawks, tiny, agile scouts with hooks fitted under their top wings. The pilots called trapeze operations skyhooking, and when it worked, it looked like precision ballet in the open air. Commissioned in late 1931 and based at Lakehurst, New Jersey, Akron was meant to be the United States Navy's eye in the sky. It joined fleet exercises, plotted contacts, and promised a revolution for naval aviation. This was not a blimp drifting over a parade. This was a flying warship, a symbol of an era when technology seemed to conquer distance and risk, and when the line between air and sea was becoming a battleground of ideas. The Akron lived inside a narrow margin of safety. It had buoyancy instead of heavy armour, helium instead of powder magazines, and it lived at the mercy of weather that could turn a gentle climb into a plunge. Rigid airships were tricky to fly. The crew had to keep the ship balanced from nose to tail at all times. Inside the hull were helium cells and airbags called ballonets. Adding or venting air in those bags changed the ship's internal pressure and its tilt. Dropping water ballast or burning fuel changed how much lift the ship had. Even rain on the outer skin could add enough weight to drag it down. The engines sat inside the hull and turned propellers on arms outside. Even with that power, the ship was always fighting the air, which acted like both its runway and its resistance. There were human factors. Airship handling was a craft taught by feel as much as by numbers. Experienced crews learned to read the sky, feel a downdraft through the bones of the ship, and react in seconds with ballast and power. Mooring, or securing the airship, was also dangerous. On the ground, hundreds of sailors might hold lines to secure a ship as large as Akron. A sudden gust could jerk the craft upward like a giant kite, dragging men into the air. In May 1932, during a mooring attempt near San Diego, a gust lifted Akron and several ground handlers clung to the lines. 2 fell to their deaths. It was a stark reminder that even standing near such a craft could be deadly. The weather dimension added the most unforgiving test. Thunderstorms or line squalls, which produce strong, rapid downdrafts and violent up and downdrafts, could exceed an airship's ability to climb or descend in a controlled way. Unlike a conventional aircraft, a rigid airship could not simply push the throttle and outclimb a downdraft. It managed vertical control through buoyancy and ballast. In a big storm, nature held the stronger hand. Akron's first flights in late 1931 and early 1932 were triumphs of vision. From its home at Lakehurst, it set out to prove the flying aircraft carrier concept. Inside the hull, engineers and sailors had threaded a working hangar, a workshop, fuel storage, and even bunks and mess for the crew. In controlled tests, Sparrowhawk fighters hooked to the trapeze, then released, then returned, snagging the drooping bar with a practiced motion. One Chesapeake Bay demonstration felt like a preview of a future where airborne scouting would be decisive. Akron also showcased range. It cruised down the East Coast, then across to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean for the Navy's large-scale exercises. It scouted, tracked, and relayed information to a battle fleet that spread from horizon to horizon. In an age when radar did not yet rule the sea, having the eyes of a flying ship to survey hundreds of miles mattered. Sailors on battleships peered up and saw their guardian angel, and many believed this was the breakthrough that would give the Navy an edge. The ship was not perfect. Its tail surfaces, large and complex, demanded careful handling. Pilots and airship officers debated the best techniques for balancing lift from helium with lift from speed, and the trapeze system required a rehearsal, almost a choreography, every time. But the dream felt tantalizingly close. There were signs of trouble too. In February 1932, Akron struck the ground during a mooring mishap in New Jersey and suffered damage. The San Diego mooring tragedy followed a few months later. Each incident became part of a learning curve that the Navy thought it could climb. After all, rigid airships had cost lives in other navies. Germany's Zeppelins had crossed oceans, and some had been lost in storms. The US Navy's own USS Shenandoah had broken up in a line squall in 1925, killing 14. Lessons were learned, they said, and Akron used non-flammable helium rather than hydrogen, avoiding the explosive risk that haunted other airships. By 1933, Akron had earned a place in the fleet and in the public imagination. It was both a curiosity and a cutting-edge machine, a sight that could draw crowds along the Jersey shore and a classified reconnaissance asset. Among the officers who believed in it most was Rear Admiral William A. Moffett, Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, a pioneer of American naval aviation. He had shepherded carriers, planes, and airships into the Navy's inventory, convinced that America's future at sea included dominance in the air. On April 3, 1933, Akron lifted from Lakehurst once more. The plan was modest. This was not an ocean crossing or a fleet problem. It was a simple night flight to calibrate a radio direction finder along the New Jersey coast between Barnegat Light and the Ambrose Lightship. Routine work, the kind of careful preparation that keeps ships safe. On board were 76 men, including Admiral Moffett and Akron's commanding officer, Commander Frank C. McCord, the ship's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Herbert V. Wiley, a seasoned airship officer, took his station. The Atlantic was dark, cold, and unsettled. The calendar said early spring, but the barometer hinted at trouble. In the next few minutes, a training flight would turn into a fight for survival, and one of the most decorated officers in US naval aviation would face a choice between calm leadership and the panic that storms can demand. Shortly after midnight, on April 4, Akron ran into a line of storms off the New Jersey coast. Sailors later described rain that hit like gravel and wind that arrived from different directions as if the weather could not make up its mind. Thunderheads stacked over the cold Atlantic. Inside the control car, officers tracked the altimeter and barometer, calling for ballast to be dropped, engines to go to full power, and ballonets to be adjusted. Airships live by buoyancy and balance. In a line squall, downdrafts can shove a ship downward as if pressing a hand against a beach ball. If the ship is heavy because of rain on the hull or fuel burned in a way that shifts the balance, that push becomes a fall. The Akron descended. Control inputs fought the air, engines roared, ballast went overboard, and the sea came up fast. The stern dropped first, either from a downdraft that overcame the ship's lift or from the combination of wind and weight on the tail surfaces. Akron's crew struggled to correct the pitch. The crew attempted to regain control, including dropping water ballast, but were unable to overcome the powerful forces of the storm. With the ship low over waves that rose like black walls, there was no margin for error. At about 12:30 a.m., the tail struck the water. The impact tore the structure, threw men from their feet, and sent spray blasting through the compartments. The hull plunged into the ocean. In the dark, amid the shriek of metal and the hiss of last helium, there was only cold and chaos. Some compartments flooded immediately, others held for moments. Then the helium escaped, and the ship lost buoyancy. Akron did not explode, It was filled with non-flammable helium, but it broke up under the pounding of the sea. In the confusion, orders to abandon ship reached some men, but almost no one had a life vest. Since the mission was a routine training flight in home waters, there were no lifeboats that could be deployed quickly in those conditions. Navy protocol at the time had not required life jackets on the rigid airships. Many sailors found themselves in the Atlantic wearing heavy boots and soaked uniforms. The water was near freezing, hypothermia and exhaustion followed in minutes. Flashes of light came from lightning and from emergency flares. A distress call went out, but the storm distorted transmissions. Onshore, radio operators struggled to triangulate the position. The Barnegat lightship heard enough to know a catastrophe was unfolding. But rescue was not on the horizon. The conditions that killed the airship also kept help at bay. In that darkness, a few men found floating debris, clung to it, and waited. One survivor later recalled the feeling of helplessness as the wind shoved waves over his head again and again. He could hear voices, then silence, between thunder and the crackle of a dying ship. A German tanker, the Phoebus, responded to distress signals and braved the storm. Its crew found 3 men alive in the water and pulled them aboard. The survivors included Lieutenant Commander Herbert Wiley, who had been thrown free and managed to cling to the wreckage. The tanker's crew also recovered a few bodies, but the rest were lost to the sea. Commander McCord, the captain, and Admiral Moffat, the champion of naval aviation, were among the dead. 73 of the 76 men aboard perished. It was the greatest loss of life in any airship accident in history. The dawn revealed debris fields and a stunned coastline. U.S. Navy destroyers and Coast Guard vessels reached the area, but most of what could be found were fragments and grief. In a further twist of fate, a Navy blimp sent out in the poor weather to search for survivors. The J-3 crashed on the same day, killing 2 more men. A simple calibration flight had become a multi-layered tragedy. The US Navy convened a court of inquiry. Testimony from the 3 survivors, merchant sailors, weather observers, and radio operators provided a picture of what had happened. The consensus pointed to weather as the primary cause, a violent line squall that imposed rapid vertical currents on a heavy airship flying at low altitude. The ship's low height left little space to recover from a downdraft, and any rain loading from the storm would have made the airship heavier. The structure likely began to break on or shortly after water impact. But the weather was not the end of the story. The absence of life-saving equipment magnified the death toll. No life jackets, no quick-to-deploy rafts, and limited training for water ditching meant that men who might have lived drowned. The inquiry also examined operational decisions. Why fly in deteriorating conditions? Why not turn back sooner? Why was a senior admiral aboard on a night with a questionable forecast? The answers reflected the culture of the time. Airships operated in all weather within reason, and in 1933, predicting the exact path and severity of a line squall at night was guesswork. In the days that followed, the nation mourned. Admiral Moffat was given a hero's farewell. Newspapers printed images of the airship's graceful profile alongside grim accounts from the survivors and the German tanker crew. At Lakehurst, where Akron had been based, sailors pulled their collars against the wind and looked at the empty mooring masts. An entire approach to naval scouting had been dealt a blow. Reforms came quickly. Life jackets became standard equipment. Collapsible rubber rafts and improved emergency procedures were added to airships and aircraft. Training emphasized weather avoidance with greater caution. The Navy doubled down on understanding line squalls and wind shear. Yet, the loss of Admiral Moffat, the program's most influential advocate, left a vacuum. Political support for rigid airships drained away. The Navy continued operating Akron's sister ship, USS Macon, a similar flying aircraft carrier, and learned from the tragedy. When Macon later suffered structural failure and crashed off California in 1935, the presence of life jackets and rafts meant most of her crew survived. The comparison underscored how the Akron tragedy had changed procedures and saved lives. As the decade unfolded, technology took different paths. Aircraft carriers at sea grew in power and number. Monoplane fighters and scout planes multiplied their range and reliability. Radar emerged near the end of the decade. The need for a floating hangar in the sky receded. The idea of an airborne scout fleet did not die, it transformed. In a sense, the Akron and Macon were early ancestors to the concept of an airborne early warning platform, an eye in the sky that coordinates contacts far beyond the horizon. But the Navy and the nation no longer had an appetite for giant, rigid airships. The risks felt too crushing, the returns too uncertain. Today, the story of the USS Akron stands at a strange crossroads of awe and sorrow. It is a testament to American ambition and ingenuity, to a period in American history when the nation believed we could solve hard problems with audacity. It is also a reminder that the sea and the sky are unforgiving. That technology can only go so far against the raw power of weather, and that safety protocols written in peacetime matter. At Lakehurst, memorials recall not only the Hindenburg fire, but also the quieter disaster that killed more people with barely a flame. The names of Akron's crew, officers and enlisted men, engineers and riggers remind us that behind each headline are lives, plans and families. History sometimes forgets the USS Akron because it did not burn in dramatic newsreels. It vanished into a cold Atlantic night, taking with it a philosophy of flight and a generation of expertise. For those of us who look back, the lesson is not that risk should be avoided. It's that risk should be understood, respected, and mitigated with relentless attention to detail. Safety equipment, weather discipline, and training that imagines the worst and prepares for it. In that sense, Akron's legacy rides on every aircraft carrier that launches its air wing into uncertain skies, on every airborne early warning plane that circles far from home, and on every checklist that saves a life before anyone knows it was in danger. The flying aircraft carrier did not survive the 1930s, but the urge to see farther, faster, and more clearly did, and it was purchased at a price we should never discount. The USS Akron was a marvel, a rigid airship built to serve as a flying aircraft carrier for the US Navy in the 1930s. It carried small fighters on a trapeze, scouted for fleets, and symbolized a moment when America believed giant airships could change war at sea. Its challenges were steep, from delicate balance and trimming to the deadly unpredictability of the weather. Training and mooring operations carried risks that claimed lives even before the final tragedy. Akron's influence echoes through naval aviation. The airborne carrier concept did not survive, but its lessons shaped safety practices and foreshadowed modern airborne surveillance. As a chapter of American history, the Akron stands as a blend of daring and disaster. A tragedy that should be remembered not only for how it ended, but for the ambitious vision that sent a flying ship into the night.